Alright guys, welcome back. In this video, we'll be going through a for-next looping exercise rather. Okay. So in the previous video, we went through the fundamentals of the for-next loop. But remember when I told you that we want to really extend the functionality of the for-next loop, alright? Because the for-next loop is an extremely powerful loop in the world of programming. And it allows us to accomplish a lot if we have a comprehensive understanding on its capability, right? And that's exactly what we're going to explore here. So this is an example of what you may come across in your real life, right? Whether you're in high finance or whether you're a data analyst, this is definitely a good example for you to practice on. So just follow along with me. You don't have to write the codes, okay? Because I will be uploading it in the description section of, in the box below, right? So just pay attention and make sure that you understand everything that's being done. Okay. So now, let's move on to the question, right? Open the data reference workbook. So I have a data reference. I have two workbooks. One is the data reference workbook, right? This data reference workbook sits on another workbook that is outside the workbook where I'm writing this question, right? So you will see a data set on the invoice tracking sheet. So I've opened the other workbook and I'm seeing a data set, right? I'm seeing a data set which is basically named as invoice tracking data set. So it's a table with the invoice number and the amount, okay? Compare it against the SOA, statement of account data set on this sheet. So on this sheet, on this workbook, where the question is being bent out, I have the SOA data set. So SOA stands for statement of account. For those of you who are in finance, this might be a terminology that you're familiar with. Okay? And find any outlier on the two sets of data. Outliers, specifically in this context, is entry found in the SOA data set, but not on the invoice tracking data set. Number two, entry found in the invoice tracking data set, but not found on the SOA data set. List all the two entries on the outlier worksheet on this workbook. So on this very workbook where the question is penned out, I have two sets of table, right? These two sets of table will populate the results of the outlier. Okay, the first set of the table is for the SOA, whatever that's on the SOA but not on the invoice tracking, whatever that's on the invoice tracking, not on the SOA for the second set. Okay, note the macro should be accounted for an expanding data set. Okay, so we are assuming that the data set is continuously growing. Okay, so it's not a static data set, data are being added continuously. So the macro should be able to accommodate for a dynamic data set. Okay, so in essence, right, basically what the question is asking you is, well, I want to make sure that all of the invoice number in the SOA data set are in the invoice data set, right? All the entries in the SOA data set has to be registered into the invoice data set. If any of the invoice number in the SOA data set has not been registered into the invoice data set, we know that is an outlier, meaning that it exists in the SOA, but it doesn't exist in the invoice tracking. So the results should appear here for further actions of the management of finance, whomsoever it is, okay? Likewise, for all of my entries in the invoice tracking data set, I want to make sure that these entries, all of the entries, are available or registered in the SOA data set. And if any of the entries in the invoice tracking data set has not been registered into the SOA data set, we know this is an outlier in the invoice tracking data set. So that value should be returned onto the outliers tab, right, into the invoice tracking but not SOA table, meaning, right, that whatever that's on the invoice tracking but it's not on the SOA. So that's exactly what we mean when we say outliers. Okay, outliers, basically the one that is not part of the streamline, not part of the process. Because in the ideal situation, we want to make sure that everything on the statement of account should be registered into the invoice tracking. And likewise, everything on the invoice tracking should be registered into the SOA. So any outlier in either set of the data must be recognized and identified. And we're going to develop an automation module using the for next looping principle. Okay, so let's think about how we're going to approach this problem. The way we're going to do this is we're going to run a loop. Okay, we're going to run a loop whereby we're going to check each entry of, in the example of the SOA, right? In the example of the SOA, we're going to check each entry of the SOA against the entire data set of the invoice tracking. Against the entire data set of the invoice tracking. We're going to check each entry. And if it so happened that there is no match, okay, if there is no match, if the value has not been registered into the invoice tracking. And how do we know it's not been registered into invoice tracking? When we have ran through the entire data set of the invoice tracking against the entry of the SOA data set. That's why we're going to run through each entry. We're going to basically cross-check each entry and loop it against the entire invoice tracking data set. And that's the exact same thing we're also doing for the invoice tracking data set. We are running each entry on the invoice tracking data set against the entire table of the SOA. So 5 will be checked against the entire SOA, 6 will be checked against the entire SOA, 7 will be so forth until the end. Okay, so what we're actually doing here is we are actually doing, if you have understood it by now, some of you may be getting a hang of it. Yes, we're using nested for loop. Okay, we're going to have an outer loop and an inner loop. That's exactly what we're doing. Okay, that's how we're going to perform the cross-checking. Okay, and the results will then, the outliers will then be returned into these two tables, right? Okay, so that's the basic approach. And also remember, the macro is an expanding data set. Okay, so with that in mind, let's get on to the exercise. Sub, and I'm just going to name this macro sub for next loop exercise. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to link the two workbooks together. So I'm going to link the other workbook where the invoice tracking data set lies, okay, as workbook. I'm just going to name it as workbook. Okay, and then I'm going to dim the other sheet. Okay, basically the invoice tracking, this sheet basically, right? The invoice tracking sheet, right, as worksheet, because we have to link the two workbooks together. We have done this before, right? We've done this before, so we're just going to use some of the knowledge that we have learned previously. Okay, then we're going to use the keyword set because it's an object. Remember, worksheet range. Okay, this tree is the main tree that you should write. We can't use the code name, right? We have to use this referencing, because remember, we can only use the code name if the worksheet is on the same workbook where you're writing the macro on. And in this case, no, right? So what's the name of the workbook? Data reference, right? Make sure there's a single spacing. Therefore, reference workbook.xlsm. Okay. And then I'm going to declare the other sheet simply as other workbook, right? Which is basically workbooks data reference. I don't like to put them all in one line, right? I prefer to do it this way. And I encourage you to do it this way as well, right? It's just good programming practice. What's the tab name? Invoice tracking, right? There's the tab name. Other workbook dot, right? It's a space. Shouldn't be a space there, right? Should be just dot worksheet. Okay. So this is how you should be doing it, right? Because it's good programming practice, and if you're passing on this code to someone in the future, they'll be able to understand what you're doing pretty quickly. So now we're going to find the last row for this workbook, basically the SOA data set, right? Remember that this is an expanding range, right? So we're using most of what we have learned previously, right? Right? So far, not most, we have been using all of it, right? Right. Last row equals to sheet. We can use the code name. So the code name is just sheet 2. You don't have to use the tab name, right? You don't have to use the tab name. So the range for the SOA was on, I think, column A, right? Yeah, it was in column A, right? Both data sets were in column A and B, right? So A and rows.count. Okay, so this is something referencing last rows and last column. Gone through that in detail, right? So for those of you, who are missing out on that, please do go back and watch them, right? Last row for invoice tracking dataset, basically the other workbook, right? The other workbook, which was the data reference workbook, right? So I'm gonna deem that as last row other as long, and last row other is simply going to be, we can't use the sheet code name, right? We have to use other sheet, right? That's why I've already referenced the other sheet here, right? Which is the other workbook dot work, which is other workbooks, meaning this workbooks, right? So this is how you should be doing it, right? This is a clean way to write your code. Okay, so I always teach you the clean and something that good programming practice, as they call them, right? So this is good programming practice. Dot count dot and XLR dot row. Okay, now we're going to set the counter for the looping, right? Counter for looping SOA, right? Which is this workbook, right? So just going to deem that as I, right? Okay, counter for looping on the other workbook, right? Basically the invoice tracking data set, right? The invoice tracking data set just sits on the data reference workbook. I'm going to dim that as J, right? Whatever, you can dim it as whatever you want. Okay, now we also have to account for the fact that we are populating the data onto the outliers tab. Okay, so we are populating it from 4, right? A, B, E, and F, right? So we're populating it onto 4, right? On row 4. Okay, on row 4. So for that reason, I'm just going to say outliers tab populating. Okay, so we can just dim K as long and dim, I don't know, we can just use M, right? So I'm going to say K equals to 4, M equals to 4. Why I have 2 is because I want to make a distinction between the two sets of data, right? So K is for the SOA and M is for the invoice tracking, right? So I'm just going to write that. K for SOA populate, M for invoice populate, the invoice outlier populate, right? So far everything is good. Now what I want to do next is I want to make sure that when the macro is being run, the data set, right, I mean the worksheet is clean, right? Which means that we don't have any of the previous entries that are on the way, right? So suppose we have run the code previously and we want to run the code again. We want to make sure that these entries, all the entries that have been generated from the previous code are interrupting the new code, right? So, or getting in the way, meaning that it's being added, right? So we want to make sure that the worksheet is clean, right? The outliers worksheet has to be clean from A4 to F, whatever, right? Whatever. I can just set any value, right? You can either find the last row, or I can just put a very huge number. Okay, generally I prefer just put a big number because we're already doing a very complicated example, so we don't want to make it even more complicated, right? Right. So that's why I'm just going to say sheet 3. I can use a code name because the worksheet sits on the same workbook where the macro is written. So A4 dot F 100,000, 10,000, 100,000, 1 million. Yeah, I'll just put 1 million, right? Anyways, we only have 1 point something million in our work sheet, right? 1 million, 1.2 million, 1.1 million rows, right? So I think 1 million, if we can clear 1 million rows, I think we're pretty good, right? So far, I hope everything is clear, right? Now let's do the iteration. So, okay, let's try to understand what we're going to do here. Let's first do the case for SOA exists, but not invoice tracking. Okay, so basically we are going to look the first data set, the SOA, right? We're going to compare each entry on the SOA, right? Each entry on the SOA against the entire invoice tracking data set, right? Each entry, and we're going to check if any of the entries have a match with the invoice tracking data set. If there is a match, then we know, okay, well, it's not an outlier. It's been registered, but there's no match, then that value has to be populated onto the outlier section of the SOA, right? What exists in the SOA, but doesn't exist in the outlier. Okay, so for that, I'm going to say for I, my counter, where are we starting? The SOA, the first entry for the SOA starts from 17, right? I'm pretty sure it starts from 17. And for the invoice tracking, it starts from 5. Okay, first entry starts from 5. So keep that in mind, remember that, okay? For I equals to 17 to last row, that's the last row of the SOA data set. To last row, I don't know what happened, right? And then for J equals to 5, so we're going into the inner loop. This is the inner loop, basically the last row other, right? That was, if I'm right, okay, pronounce the last row other is the last row for the invoice tracking data set. So this is the statement, the inner loop that we're running for each iteration of I. Okay, what we're going to do, we're going to compare I17 from J5 to all the way to L other row. Okay, so how we're going to do this comparison? We're going to say a simple argument. We're just going to say if sheet2 dot reach. So if somewhere along the line, A and I, right? So we are running the first iteration. Okay, so if somewhere along the line where I17, okay, happens to have a match with any of the J that is being run, okay, so I'm just going to say other sheet happens to have a match with any of the J entry, dot value. I should put value here as well, right? Then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say, okay, well, since there is a match, I can't be bothered about I17 anymore. So I want to move to I18. So that's why we're going to exit the for loop. So what we are exiting, we are actually exiting the inner loop. Because I know that, well, if I17 is supposed to be having a match with J25, okay, then if let's say A17, right, I17 is basically the first entry, has a match with J25, then I could just exit this loop. I don't have to go through J26, so I can just exit the loop. Now, if there is no match, let's say all the way up till the end, so I17 has no match with the entire data set, what we're going to do, then we know it's an outlier, right? So first I'm going to end if, right? I'm going to exit the for loop, then I'm going to end this if statement, okay? So it's going to exit the inner loop. Basically, it's going to exit the inner loop, the J loop. Okay. So now I'm ending the if. So we are still part of the J loop. Okay. So if I exit the for loop, I'm moving to the next I. So this statement will not run. This statement here, the upcoming statement, the upcoming codes will not run, as it's part of the inner loop or J loop. Okay, so if J is equals to the last row of other, then what I'm going to say, right? So if J equals to last row other, what I mean by that is, right, so we have run through and we have gone all the way to the last row and, well, there's no match, right? There's no match. So we are not exiting the loop. We're not exiting the loop. So we are still getting to this part. So we're getting to this part. So J has come all the way to the end and J is now equal to the last row. Then we can say, then sheet 3, because if there was a match, it's going to break the loop. It's going to break this loop. This statement would never run. Okay, so this statement will only run if you have gone all the way till the end of the J loop, right? The entire data set of the invoice tracking, and find that there are no match. Okay, so the no match, and that value has to be populated, right? Then we know that this is an outlier. So we're going to say range and K. That's where the outlier, we're going to populate it, right? We're going to populate into the outlier worksheet, right? This worksheet, remember that? We're going to populate it into this worksheet, okay? We're going to populate it into this worksheet, K, right? Because K is for the, and we're going to populate the value of the outlier from the SOA, okay? Right? Okay, we're going to run, populate the value from the SOA, and then I'm just going to say K equals to K plus 1. Why I'm saying K equals to K plus 1 is because we populated the K value, right? The first K is 4, and then we want to make sure that when we run to the next I, K is still not 4. K has to be 5 now, right? Right? So remember, what we're basically doing is we are running through this loop. We're comparing I17 against J5 to the entirety. So if there's a match, it exits the loop, right? We're actually exiting the inner loop, okay? So it's this statement is not going to run. This statement is not going to run, okay? And then we're moving to the next I. But if there is no match, okay, then we're going to come to this point, right? So we're going to say if J equals to last row other, meaning if this J has gone all the way till the end, right? Which is the last entry of the invoice tracking data set. So we have checked 17 against all the way to the till the end, and there's no match. So this is when this code, right? If J equals to last row other, then we know that A and K, right? A and K, basically the value that we are populating into has to be a value that has not been found in the invoice tracking. Basically the AI, which is A17 here. Okay, so I'm going to end this if, and then I'm going to have a next counter for the J loop and the next counter for the I loop. Okay, so this is how we get around with finding the outliers for the SOA. So how are we going to do with the invoice tracking? We do exactly for invoice tracking. We just reverse the loop. Okay, reverse the loop. Now we're going the other way around. Okay, we're going to say for J equals to 5 to last row other. Now this is going to be part of the inner loop, right? I equals to 17 to last row. Okay, I'm just referring to whatever that I've written here. Okay, and then I'm going to say if other sheet dot range A and J dot value equals to sheet 2, right? I'm just doing exactly what I've written previously. I'm just reversing it around. Okay, I'm just reversing it around. Range A and I dot value. Okay, then if there is a match, we're going to exit the loop, right? We're going to exit the loop. Okay, we are exiting inner loop, which is I loop. Okay, that's what we're doing. Okay, so when we exit the loop, basically when you exit the inner loop, it's going to move to the next chain. It's not going to come to this point. It will never come to this point. All right, you have to remember that. Okay, because this section is part of the inner loop. Okay, the exit is the I loop, so we're just doing the exact same thing, right? Exit for, and then we're going to end if, right? Okay. Okay, so these the upcoming codes once again will not run as it's part of the inner loop, which is the I loop, right? We're just reversing the loop. So if I equals to last row now, right? If I equals to last row, then if it's come to this point, we know that there's just no match, right? It's J has gone from 5 all the way up to the I from 17, so I has reached its final row, and then the loop was not broken, so it's come to the final point. If I equals to last row, then sheet 3 dot range, I think it was E, right? Yeah, it was E, right? Yeah, it was E, right? The invoice tracking, but not in the SOA. We're populating into this section, right? The first one was this part, and now it's this part E, right? A and B. Then we have, right? We right before that, yeah. Fortunately, I noticed that we have to put the B as well here, right? So just bear with me, right? And K dot value equals to sheet 2 dot range gives us the amount, right? The amount. So we have the invoice number and the amount. Okay, right? Okay. So similarly, we're just going to say shifter dot. And what was the other variable for M? It was M, right? M, right? E and M dot value. So E and M initially were 4, right? So M was for the last row for the invoice tracking sheet on the outlier tab, right? Option range. What are we populating? Range A and J, right? Of the other sheet, right? Which was the invoice data sheet. Dot value. Okay. And then I'm gonna say sheet 3 dot range F. Okay, that's the amount that we're populating onto it, right? Onto the invoice tracking. On the outlier work tab of the invoice tracking outlier data table, right? Other sheet dot range B and J dot value, and M has to be M plus 1, and then we're going to do and the if, and then of course we have to close the counter of both loop, right? We have next I, and then we have next J, right? So basically what we've done is we've just reversed the loop. Okay, we've reversed the loop. So we are checking now if for J, for the entry of J, basically the invoice tracking data table, against all the entries in the SOA data set. So if there happens to be a match, then we exit the for loop. So when we exit the for loop, so remember these statements are all part of the inner loop. The inner loop. We are exiting the inner loop, which is the I loop, right? So this statement will never run. So but this event, this is inevitably to run. So we're just going to put this as a safeguard measure. So we're going to say that, well, J5 has gone all the way up to the last row. I has now reached the last row. And if I equals to last row, then we know, well, for certainty, we know that the value has not been registered for that particular J, right? For that particular J5, okay, there's no match. That's why it's come to this point. So we've checked all the way up till the last row. There is no match, and that's why we're populating that J value onto the outlier step. Okay, onto the outlier step. Okay, so this was for the first case of SOA, and the second case for the invoice tracking. Right. So I think that's about it. I think the code should run now. Right. So I just want to make sure that we're not missing anything. All right. I hope we're not missing anything. And I'm just going to run the code. Okay. The code seems to be running. Now I'm going to get to my outliers. And sure enough, you see, I could see everything here. All right. So I'm just going to format this to currency. I'm just going to format this to United States currency. Right. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to clear all of them again. Okay. And then we're going to run the code again. We're going to run the code. Right. And you can see everything is been here. So now it's completely dynamic. We can test that. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to put some random number here. Right. I'm just going to put some number that I know is definitely not there. Right. So there's some huge number. And then I'm just going to change the value here to something, right? Right. So we have another outlier here. We have another outlier in the SOA, right? That is definitely not on the invoice tracking data set because it's just been added a second ago, right? So we're going to remember the number, right? Some many zeros with 2024, okay? And then with a macro, I'm going to run it again. And look at that. We are seeing this number, right? We're seeing this number that we just keyed in a few seconds ago. And likewise, I'm going to test it with the invoice tracking data set, right? I'm going to put some numbers. Okay. So I'm just going to put some big numbers, 2024 ending. And then I'm just going to put some value, random value here. Okay, 6, 7, 8. Okay, right now it should be here, but yeah, never mind. Okay, so we're gonna go and then we're gonna run the loop again. And sure enough, we're seeing it here. Okay, we're seeing it here. Okay, so I just have to format the currency. I know why the currency is not getting formatted, right? I think I should format this in advance, right? So I don't know why it's not getting formatted when the code reruns. Okay, maybe I have to do the formatting on VBA, but usually it doesn't, right? So that, never mind. Okay, but not worry too much about the formatting now. Okay, not worry too much about the formatting now. Okay, so that's about it on how we approach the Forex situations, right? You can have outer loop, you can have the inner loop, and just work your way around, and you can develop complex automation solutions. All right, guys, that's about it. Thank you, and I will see you again.